They debated calling the police about Ralph, but it was a very short debate. Ned pointed out that they'd probably just send Dorf again, and if it was a question of putting up with either Ralph or Dorf, they'd probably be better off with Ralph. In any case, the Mad Prophet of Crystal Lake, as Ned had christened him, seemed to have vacated the premises, and they had decided to forget about it. Jack, especially, wasn't anxious to give Dorf any reason to search through their belongings. He decided he should probably give some serious thought to finding a safe place for his stash, just in case. They started dinner, with Brenda tossing a salad and Jack frying hamburgers. It had been a long day, and they were all starved. The clouds started rolling in, as Steve had predicted, and it looked as if it was going to storm. "Who'd like some rare?" Jack called from the grill. "Me," said Marcy. Brenda made a face and shuddered. "How can you guys eat that stuff?" she said. "It looks like dead animals." "Dead animals?" Ned looked at her in mock disgust. "That's old counselors. You cannibals." "Well," said Brenda, serving the salad, "if you would mix all this stuff right, you'd get all the protein you need." "Too bad Annie never showed up," said Bill, raising the top half of his bun and peering dubiously at his hamburger. "She was supposed to be quite a good cook." "Yeah, well, don't expect me to play chef to you guys," said Marcy. "Uh-oh," groaned Ned. "The squaws are revolting." Marcy threw a bun at him. It was starting to get dark as the storm approached, and Alice reached up to pull the string attached to the light fixture. The light didn't come on. She pulled the string several times with no result. "Trouble?" Bill said. "Yeah," said Alice. "Either a bad bulb or no power. Seems a little gloomy in here." "Steve taught me how to use the emergency generator," said Jack. "The town power lines are supposed to be real lousy." "God, don't you love that macho talk?" joked Ned. He lowered his voice. "Emergency generator." Jack wished he'd give it a rest. The more he was around Brenda, the sillier Ned got. It had become obvious to everyone that Ned really liked her, but he was acting like a little kid. If Brenda had pigtails, Ned would probably be following her around with an ink pot. "You want to give me a hand?" Jack asked Bill, shaking his head in resignation. "Yeah, let's go." Bill rose from the table. "Wait for me," said Brenda. "Neddy, can you watch the burgers?" Jack said. "Sure." "Burn 'em," Brenda grimaced. Alice handed Ned some buns. "You want to heat these?" "Yeah," said Ned, making a big production out of rearranging all the burgers on the grill, flourishing the spatula like a conductor leading an orchestra. Alice sighed. Maybe Ned was being a bit juvenile, but at least he didn't keep his feelings secret. If Brenda held up a hoop, he'd undoubtedly jump through it. There was something to be said for that kind of puppy-like infatuation. It was sort of cute, and she could tell that Brenda was responding to it. She wished Steve would be a bit more demonstrative. He was always so serious, so intense. She wished he'd lighten up a little. One would think from the way he acted that everything at Camp Crystal Lake was a matter of life or death. Bill shut the door behind them as Brenda switched on the flashlight, aiming it at the old gasoline-powered generator. The wind was starting to pick up outside. All they needed now was a power failure, just as a storm was about to hit. "You really think he's going to be bent out of shape?" Brenda asked as Jack approached the generator. "I don't know," said Jack. They weren't looking forward to Steve's reaction when he learned there was something wrong with the power lines. Throughout the day, He'd been obsessive about every little detail of each job they had done, running into town to pick up more supplies every few hours, making up new lists of things for them to do, checking on their work when he got back, and finding fault with everything. None of them looked forward to sitting out a storm in a cabin without any lights, listening to Steve complaining about all the things they hadn't done. Bill scanned the interior of the cabin, the oldest one in the camp. It needed too much renovation to be useful as a dorm for the campers, so Steve had designed it as the plant cabin, the one where they kept all the tools and emergency supplies. "Hey," said Billy, glancing at the generator, "this looks almost like the one at my uncle's cabin in Maine." "What, an antique?" said Brenda. "Well, here goes," said Jack, priming it. He threw the switch, kicked it over, and it sputtered into life, making a sound like an outboard motor about to throw a rod. "What hath God wrought?" Brenda watched the generator shudder on its mounts as if it were alive. Jack dusted off his palms and stepped back from it, watching it dubiously. He wouldn't have been surprised if it shook itself apart, but it seemed to work. They went outside and looked at the sky. It was a cloudy, blue-gray. The wind had died down and everything was still, as if waiting for the storm to break. The surface of the lake was mirror smooth. Marcy came out to join them. Jack took her hand. Everything seemed quiet and peaceful. It was nice having the camp to themselves for a while. No campers to watch over yet. No nervous camp director to badger them about their work each time they stopped to take a breath. Jack led Marcy down to the lake shore, past the dock and toward the woods. They walked across some fallen logs, then stopped in a little stand of trees, sheltered from the others. Marcy smiled and came into his arms. They kissed. Ned stood by a tree on a path between the cabins, watching them. He could just barely see them through the trees. He smiled and whistled softly between his teeth, thinking about Brenda. He always felt a little awkward around girls he liked. He knew he acted a bit foolish, but he couldn't really help himself, and Brenda didn't seem to mind. She actually seemed to like him. He sighed and started walking back to the cabin he shared with Jack. As he approached, he thought he saw someone standing on the porch, looking out where Jack and Marcy stood kissing in the trees. "Hello?" he said. Whoever it was moved quickly back into the shadows. Ned hesitated, thinking about crazy old Ralph. He had seemed harmless enough, just a skinny old guy with crazy eyes, not much to him at all. But you never could tell with crazy people. Yet, if Ralph were really dangerous, he doubted that the local police would allow him to run around loose. Just the town character, he thought. But he didn't like the idea of Ralph being in their cabin, going through their things. He hurried toward the cabin, but whoever had been on the porch had gone inside. He heard the door creak. He paused at the steps leading to the porch, took a deep breath, then started up. He paused again outside the door. "Can I help you?" he said. He rolled his eyes. "Can I help you?" What was he, a sales clerk in a convenience store? "Christ, be firm, Ned," he told himself. "Get in there and chase the old loony out before he steals something." He stepped in and scanned the cabin. There wasn't anyone in sight. "Hello? Hello?" He heard a step behind him, but before he could turn around, someone grabbed a handful of his hair and gave a hard, sharp jerk. His head snapped back and he opened his mouth to cry out, but before he could utter a sound, a gleaming steel blade flashed briefly in front of his eyes, and he felt a line of fire burn across his neck, a searing, stinging, white-hot pain as the knife slashed his throat from ear to ear. His legs gave way beneath him, and he coughed, choking on the flood of blood, trying in vain to gasp for air. Everything seemed to turn incredibly, indescribably bright for a brief instant, and then he felt himself falling. He was dead before he hit the floor. Jack lit the way before them with a flashlight as he and Marcy ran back to the cabin. The wind had picked up again, sending the clouds scuttling across the sky and churning the surface of the lake into whitecaps. "Come on!" gasped Marcy, running ahead of him, trying to catch her breath. The flashlight beam bounced crazily as Jack ran to keep up with her. I'm coming. He made it up the hill and paused, breathing hard. Whew! Whoa! Wind's come up. It shifted a good 180 degrees. Makes me want to hold on to you, Marcy smiled, coming into his arms. Jack kissed her long and hard, then looked into her eyes. His cabin was right behind them, and everyone else was back in the main cabin, cleaning up after dinner. He looked toward the darkened cabin behind them, then back at Marcy. She watched him silently for a moment. What about Ned? She asked. I don't love Ned, Jack said. Besides, he was sure Ned would be back at the main cabin, mooning over Brenda. They'd been talking about breaking out one of the games and maybe smoking a few. He didn't think Ned would be coming back to their cabin any time soon. Marcy laughed. He keeps acting like such a jerk. Neddy! Jack shouted, though not loud enough for anyone in the main cabin to hear over the wind. Stop it, Marcy said. Don't call him. Her eyes were steady on his. I thought you wanted to give him one of your motherly lectures, Jack said, trying not to think about how much he wanted her. Look, Neddie's going to do whatever Neddie wants to do, you know. Oh, it's going to storm. He moistened his lips. It can tear down that valley like a son of a gun. As if to punctuate his comment, thunder rolled just beyond the valley. The storm was approaching fast. They sat down on a log, and Marcy scooted closer to him. I've been afraid of storms ever since I was a little kid, she said. No, really? She laughed, slightly embarrassed. Yeah, I've had this dream where I'm in a thunderstorm and it's raining really hard. It sounds like pebbles when it hits the ground. I can hear it. And I try to block out the sound with my hands over my ears, only it doesn't work. It just keeps getting louder and louder. And then the rain turns to blood. And the blood washes away in little rivers. And the sound stops. She shook her head and shivered as drops began to splatter around them. It's just a dream, said Jack. Yeah, I know, Marcy grimaced. I'll call it my shower dream. Lightning flashed. Jack laughed. Hey, this is no dream. Come on, we're going to get soaked. He led her into the cabin as the wind whipped across the lake, bending the treetops. He turned off the flashlight as they entered the cabin. They were alone in the dark. Marcy pushed up against him, kissed him seductively, and slowly started to unbutton his shirt. Jack shut his eyes and swallowed. It seemed that it had been building up to this for a long, long time, but he had never thought it would happen. He couldn't believe how much he wanted her. He thought about the conversation he once had with Nettie. Just because you want something doesn't necessarily mean you should have it, he had said. And now, here he was, alone with Marcy in the dark, in an empty cabin on a secluded lake, with thunder crashing and lightning flashing in the sky. And Marcy was afraid of thunderstorms. He remembered hearing somewhere that some women were excited by thunderstorms and by fear. Was he taking advantage of the situation? No, he told himself. She's ready. She's making the choice. He had waited. He had never pressured her. He had allowed her to make the decision, to pick the right time and place. He ran his hands over her breasts. Her nipples were hard. She broke the kiss and made her way over to the bottom bunk, feeling her way in the dark. He sat down beside her and reached over to the nightstand, picking up a small candle and lighting it. She unbuttoned her jeans and pulled them down. She was wearing white bikini panties. He was afraid to speak, afraid to break the spell, afraid she'd change her mind at the last minute. He'd die if that happened. Alice pulled back the curtain and peered out the window of the main cabin. The storm was making the surface of the lake boil. It was raining so hard it sounded like hail hitting the roof. "Jack and Marcy are gonna get drenched," she said. Bill smiled. "Not if they're where I think they are." He plucked a few chords on the guitar. They had the fire going, and it was warm and cozy inside, a pleasant place to relax after a hard day's work. Alice threw another log on the fire and sank into a chair and stretched out, sighing contentedly. That's nice." Brenda nodded, staring into the fire. She glanced up suddenly, with a sly smile. "Hey, I know what we can do. We're going to play Monopoly." Alice groaned. "I hate Monopoly." "Not the way I play it, you don't," said Brenda, grinning as she took the game down off the shelf. "Like what?" said Bill, putting down the guitar. Brenda started to take the game out of the box and spread it out on the table. "We're going to play strip Monopoly. I'll be the shoe." She picked out her game token. "You have got to be kidding," said Alice. Brenda shook her head. Bill raised his eyebrows, intrigued by the thought. "What if Steve walks in?" We'll give him a handicap," Brenda replied quickly. "He can keep his boots on. Everything else goes. Now it's easy. Instead of paying rent, you pay clothes. Bill can be the banker." She glanced at him coyly. "Unless, of course, he's chicken." Alice laughed, thinking it might be fun. Bill grinned and joined Brenda at the table. "I guess I'm game, but heaven help you if you land in one of my hotels." "Alice, why don't you see if Marcy left any of that grass?" Brenda suggested. Bill started to sort out the play money. "What happened to my 500s?" "They're right there," Brenda said, pushing them toward him. She looked around at the cluttered surface of the table. "What happened to my shoe?" Jack and Marcy lay naked in the bed together, moving slowly, exploring one another's bodies, speaking in sighs and moans of pleasure. They had each given in to the feelings of the moment, with no thought for the consequences. Rain pattered on the cabin roof. Wind whistled past the windows. Thunder rolled and lightning flashed. The soft flickering light from the candle on the nightstand illuminated only their one small corner of the cabin. Shadows danced across their bodies. The rest of the room was plunged in darkness, a darkness that had enveloped Ned as he lay lifeless on the bunk above, his throat slashed, his eyes wide open, seeing nothing, his blood seeping into the mattress. And there was something else inside that darkened cabin with them, a hate that seethed with mindless fury, raging for revenge, waiting to reach out and take it. It was close, so very close, merely a breath away. Alice set the open beers on the table, then sat down and lit up a joint, inhaling deeply. "I'm not going to pass go without a glow," she giggled. Brenda laughed. "We've already rolled for you. You're going last, okay? And community chest can't give you back your clothes." She rolled the dice. "Double sixes. I get to roll again." Bill snipped his beer and glanced at Alice. "I think we're being hustled." "I think you're right," said Alice, leaning back in her chair and taking another toke before passing the joint to Bill. Steve wouldn't approve of this, she thought. If he came in now, he'd put a stop to it and give them all a lecture on responsibility. She sighed. He'd think all this was juvenile, silly. But it wouldn't hurt him to be a little silly and juvenile on occasion, even a little irresponsible. If he kept pushing himself like this, he'd wind up with an ulcer, and she certainly wouldn't be around to see it. She'd be dozing in the California sun. He'd been so different when she met him, gentle, compassionate, attentive. Or had she only seen what she had wanted to see? It wasn't that he was unkind or that he took her for granted. It was just that he was too wrapped up in his plans, to the point of obsession. He simply wasn't able to see what was really happening around him. Perhaps it was her fault. Perhaps she should have seen it coming. Maybe there was something about her that led her to make the same mistakes with men, over and over. She had been vulnerable when she met him, trying to get over the breakup of a relationship that hadn't been going anywhere. She had told John that she needed time away from him for a while to think, time to herself. And then along came Steve, who seemed so very different, so much more relaxed and easygoing. And now she was stuck in the same rut all over again. It was one thing to have plans, to have ambition, goals, but it was something else entirely when those goals and ambitions took over and blocked out everything else. Her father had been like that, and she had seen what it had done to her mother. Her father had been a commodities broker. He had started out with nothing, determined to make a good life for his family. He had worked like a dog, putting in long hours at the office and bringing work home with him. Always on the telephone, always with his nose stuck in the Wall Street Journal, always caught up in his dream. There was nothing wrong with pursuing a dream, she thought. There was nothing wrong with planning for the future, but you couldn't live in the future. You had to take time out to appreciate the present. Then her father started spending more time at the office than at home. Breakfast with the family became gulped coffee while he scanned the market reports. Conversations over dinner, on those rare occasions when he came home in time for it, became absent grunts and nods while his mind was somewhere else, on work. Always the work. He never spoke of anything else. Alice had watched her mother becoming more and more withdrawn, more and more alienated from her husband's world. There was never any time for vacations. There was no time for going out to dinner or the movies, or playing with the kids on weekends, or just curling up in front of the fireplace with a glass of wine and a good book. Occasionally there had been time for arguments, with her mother pleading that he shouldn't work so hard and her father insisting that he was doing it all for them, so that they could have a better life. It was always the dream of the better life, never the thought that life might just be good enough the way it was if he could only take time out to enjoy it. But he couldn't seem to find the time. That time kept drifting into the future, and finally there was no time left. Like a clock with a mainspring wound too tight, her father had finally snapped. He had died of a coronary. They had found him slumped over his office desk, a telephone receiver in either hand. He had literally worked himself to death, and his heart had burst. Alice was never going to go through anything like that again. She didn't want any part of men who became so caught in their plans and ambitions that she wound up being pushed aside. You don't work for a relationship, she thought. You work at it. And that meant communicating. It meant sharing. It meant not putting things off until some other time when it might be more convenient. That time might never arrive. When Steve came back, she was going to have to confront him with it. Maybe if she explained to him why she felt the way she did, he'd understand. Maybe then he'd open up and talk about it, instead of avoiding the subject as he always did. It was almost as if he was afraid to talk about it. She had seen the curious change come over him as they had driven up to the lake. She had seen him grow tense and moody. As they approached the camp, he had stopped the jeep at the entrance, his mouth a thin line, as he simply sat and stared through the windshield at the empty cabins on the lake shore, like an old soldier revisiting a battlefield. "What is it, Steve?" she had asked him. For a long moment he said nothing. "Steve?" He had blinked, as if coming out of a daze, and turned to look at her, a forced smile on his face. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking about all the work we have to do, that's all." But that wasn't all. She knew there was something else, something he wouldn't tell her. There was a sense of desperation about him, as if he was frightened of something. What was he so afraid of? He acted as if it were all a matter of life and death. They lay next to one another, bodies touching, basking in the warm afterglow of sex. Marcy turned on her side and kissed Jack softly on his cheek. She sighed. "You are so fine." She gave him another kiss and got out of bed. The candle on the nightstand was flickering. "Yo, where you going?" Jack said, sitting up. "I gotta pee." She felt around in the darkness for her clothes. Jack put on his shirt. Marcy found her underpants and t-shirt, pulled them on, then slipped into her raincoat without bothering to look for the rest of her clothes. They were nearby, on the floor somewhere, and she would only be gone a minute. "Hurry back, okay?" Jack grinned. "It's getting cold in here." "You'll save my place for me?" "Oh, yeah." She bent down to kiss him, then picked up the flashlight and went out the door. It was pouring. She smiled at the thought of what would happen if she ran into any of the others and they saw her barefoot in the rain, without anything on beneath her slicker except her underwear. But the light was still on in the main cabin, and she could see smoke curling from the chimney. They're probably having their own party, she thought. Alice rolled the dice. 5. She moved her playing token. "Baltic Avenue. I'll buy it." "No one ever lands on Baltic Avenue," Bill pointed out. "I think it's a pretty color," Alice said. She passed Bill the play money, and he handed her the deed card. "Okay," he said, rattling the dice in his hand and blowing on them like a crapshooter. "Come on," said Alice. He rolled the dice. "Ha! 8. Alice moved his token along the board. "Baltic Avenue. You owe me 1 boot. Hand it over." "Coming." He reached under the table to pull off his boot. "Alice draws first blood," said Brenda. "What a terrible way to talk about my feet," said Bill. He passed her the boot. "Thank you," said Alice, setting it down beside her chair. They were all starting to get a little silly. The grass was helping. So was the beer. "You know, I think I'm beginning to like this game. Just wait till you land on my old Kentucky home," Brenda threatened. She rolled the dice. "More beer?" said Bill. He quickly checked the bottles on the table. More beer. He nodded and got up to go to the refrigerator. "Let's see," said Brenda. "What railroad is that?" Jack lit up a joint and waved the match out. flicking it onto the floor. He drew the smoke in deeply and exhaled as he lay back on the bed. He thought about Marcy. He wondered if she was taking birth control pills. He wondered why he hadn't wondered about that before. It was a little late to ask himself that now. Suppose she got pregnant. Surely she was on the pill. Wasn't she? She wouldn't have sex if she weren't on the pill, thought Jack. But then, on the other hand, he'd had sex and he hadn't used a condom. Why wasn't that the same? Wasn't it being sexist to expect her to take full responsibility for them both being protected? Was it fair to justify it by telling himself that he got carried away? What with the thunder and the lightning getting her excited, and the dark, romantic cabin, and being all alone out in the woods, her being so near and touching him and looking up at him like that. He reassured himself that he had never pressured her, that she had made the choice. But what if she got pregnant? What then? They had never discussed that possibility. Would she consider having an abortion? How did she feel about that? Jack didn't even know how she felt about that. On the one hand, it was her body, and ultimately her choice. But on the other hand, he would have been a part of it as well. It wasn't something they had ever discussed. Suppose she got pregnant and decided to have the baby. What then? Marriage? Okay, he loved her, no question about that, and he also believed in doing the right thing. He could probably get a transfer to her school. Well, come to think of it, she probably wouldn't be able to go to school. Certainly not for a while. And he'd have to get a job. They'd both probably have to get jobs. Could they balance school and jobs and caring for the baby? Daycare was expensive. So were diapers, clothes, baby food, medical insurance. And all right, maybe there wasn't any question that they loved each other. But were they ready to take a step that big? How come we never talked about this shit before? Jack wondered. It wasn't that he felt guilty about what they had done. There wasn't anything wrong with that. They loved each other. They had waited until the time seemed right. It wasn't as if he had just torn off a piece only for the sake of getting laid. But this was Marcy, someone he really cared about. But if you really care about someone, Jack thought, you communicate with them. You find out how they feel about things. You talk things out. Why was it so difficult to talk about sex? Oh, it wasn't hard at all to talk about it with other guys, like Nettie. But why did it seem awkward to sit down and just discuss it, in a non-threatening way with a girl you cared about? For that matter, he thought, why couldn't a bunch of us just sit down together and talk about it? Just between ourselves, a nice, friendly, loose discussion. Find out how we feel about things. Bounce ideas off each other. He imagined himself walking up to the other guys some night, like maybe tomorrow night, when they were gathered around a campfire, having a few beers, maybe smoking a few, and saying, "Hey, what do you say we talk about sex?" Of course, they'd probably laugh. So would he if Nettie had said something like that. But after they had laughed, and laughing was good to break the tension, he could tell them he was serious, that he wasn't saying that they should talk about, doing it, but how they really felt about it, what concerns they had about relationships and things like that. Why couldn't they talk about things like that in a serious, sharing sort of way? Right then, he decided he was going to have a long talk with Marcy that night. That instead of just jumping back into bed with each other and picking up where they'd left off, as much as he wanted to do it again, they were going to talk first, really talk and find out how they felt about things, about their plans, and how they truly felt about each other. You shouldn't just let your feelings take control, he thought. They'd just been physically intimate with one another, and it was past time they got mentally intimate as well. maybe nothing would change. There had been a strong sense of inevitability about this. Ever since they knew they would be moving on to different schools, meeting new people, probably forming new relationships, the tension had been there. It was something they both felt, but they'd never really talked about it. It seemed they both knew it would happen, and it also seemed they both knew it would happen sometime this summer. It was a large part of why they decided to take jobs at the camp together, so they could get away and be by themselves before their paths took them in different directions. Deep down, maybe they both knew that after this summer, it would be over for them. It didn't really have to be, but it would be hard to keep things going with all the changes that were coming. They had to go for it while there was still time, but they had never talked. "You gotta go for it," one of Jack's friends at school had said when they discussed their girlfriends one evening in the locker room after basketball practice. "I mean, you gotta ask yourself," Jack's friend had said. "What are you waiting for?" "I'm waiting for it to be right," Jack replied. "Yeah, you could wait forever that way," warned his friend. "I don't want to pressure Marcy," Jack said. "Did it ever occur to you that maybe she's waiting for you to make the move?" "Yeah, sure. I thought about it, but..." "But what? You're going to be going to state and Marcy's going to be going to Boston. You think she's not going to meet new guys up there? You think you're not going to meet new girls?" "Well, if that's the way it's going to be," said Jack, "then maybe we shouldn't do it, you know? I mean, if it's not going to lead to anything." "Who says it's not going to lead to something? What are you saying? You want to get married? For Christ's sake! You want to wind up sitting all alone in your college dorm some night and thinking about what might have been? All right, so you're waiting for her. I can understand that, I guess. But you ever think that maybe she might be getting tired of waiting for you? You gotta go for it, man. Life's too short." Jack took another long drag on the joint. Maybe his friend was right. Well, the tension was over now. They'd done it, and it had been great. Better than he could ever have imagined. And he didn't feel sorry that they'd done it. No sorrier than he felt that they'd waited. But doing it had been the easy part. They opened their bodies up to each other. But that was only part of it. Maybe it was corny, but he felt it was time for them to open up their hearts as well. Way past time. You gotta go for that, Jack thought. If you really want making love to mean something, if you really want it to be making love rather than just screwing. He felt really close to Marcy now, and he wanted to feel closer. They had to talk about it. Life was too short. Something dripped down onto his forehead. What the hell, he thought. Don't tell me the damn roof leaks. But Nettie's mattress was directly above him, not the roof. He wiped his forehead and squinted at his fingers in the light from the flickering candle. His fingers were streaked with red. What the... Something moved beneath him, and before he had time to react, an arm flashed out from underneath the bed, and he felt a strong hand clamp down on him. Powerful fingers pressed his head against the pillow, pinning him down, and even as he gasped and jerked, startled, something pricked the back of his neck, something that came up from beneath the bed, pushing through the mattress. Pain suddenly shot through him as the razor-sharp hunting arrow ripped through his throat. The hand pushing it through the mattress, twisting the aluminum shaft, forcing it up to tear through the soft flesh just beneath his Adam's apple. He opened his mouth to scream, but only gagging sounds came from his ruined throat as the razor-headed arrow impaled him through the neck, flooding his mouth with blood from his severed arteries, choking him. He thrashed against the powerful grip, but it was too late. His failing vision saw the triangular tip of the arrow come bursting through his neck, visible now thrusting up just below his chin as blood came plummeting out in a fountain. And then there was time only for a few fragmented, fleeting thoughts, the realization that he was dying, already dead, the agonized not knowing who or why, and one last searing flash of pain, a whiteness bursting against his eyes, so bright, so incredibly, painfully bright.